Well, a very warm welcome to another vlog. It's the first week in November. It's quite mild. The woodland here at Tumnafinnog in County Wicklow looks glorious. Beautiful autumn colours. But that's not what I'm after today as a primary reason for my visit here. Over the course of the past few weeks, I've managed to get out and about photographing fungi, and I've enjoyed it immensely. So this video is about the lessons that I've learned and tips that I hope will help you out when photographing fungi in a woodland. Now, this year, 2024, hasn't been a great year for fungi. We had quite a dry period earlier on in the year. I've been to Tumnafinnog for a quick afternoon visit a couple of days ago. The fungi are at the stage where they're about to fade. So I thought I would grab this opportunity to come down and to take maybe one or two photographs today and to impart those lessons that I've learned over the past few weeks. And by doing so, it may help me improve my macro photography, and I hope it's helpful to you. So the first tip, and what I would consider the most important tip, and it may seem like common sense, but that is perspective, and specifically a low perspective. I think it's very important to, first of all, compare the approach to photography of fungi with other genres of photography, specifically landscape photography or portraiture photography. And perspective is paramount in both of those genres. So let's take portraiture for an example. No portrait photographer would even consider taking a stepladder out, climbing up on the stepladder and looking down on their model's head. And when you compare that ridiculous statement that I've made, and when I look through photography sites such as Flickr, I see so many photographs of fungi taken with that approach. In other words, the photograph is taken directly above or to the side of a mushroom, but always looking down on the mushroom. So the most important tip in my book is perspective. The camera must be at a minimum level with the cap of the mushroom, and preferably it should be beneath the mushroom to see the gills, because the gills underneath that cap are one of the most beautiful aspects of any mushroom. So tip number one, a very simple tip. Never take a photograph of a mushroom unless you've good compositional reason to do so. It's not always easy or feasible to do that. In this scenario here with this fungi, it's on a slope, the fungi is on a log. I can actually set up a tripod with a foot height. But come prepared to the forest particularly. I have an old pair of waterproof trousers that I can throw down on the forest floor, and that makes it more comfortable and drier for me to lie down. Now, with many modern cameras, the flippy screen does enable us to put the camera down low and for us to kneel and be in a more comfortable position. I don't think it's ideal because I would rather look through the viewfinder and I can see all four corners of the frame of the photograph much more clearly in the viewfinder rather than on the LCD. So that's tip number one. Let's move on now to the next location. So the second tip I have for you today, and it's a lesson I have learned, is when you select a subject and be fussy about the subject you're selecting, then make a commitment and devote time to it. So composition and time are interlinked. We have the low perspective from tip number one. So now we need to consider all aspects, the four corners of the frame. Now we can use our rule of thirds or other rules of photography, but more importantly, we can assess ourselves what is pleasing to the eye. But we can only do that by analysing and examining the scene around the subject. So this tiny subject here now, I am asking myself the question, is it worth setting up? Because if I set up, I'm going to devote a half an hour to photographing this tiny mushroom. And similarly to landscape photography, if we travel 2 or 3 hours to get to a beautiful location, we're going to spend 2 or 3 hours getting one composition. So why can't we do that with fungi and with macro photography? So I'm in a position now where I really need to make a decision on this tiny mushroom. So I made a decision to invest the time in the composition, given the beauty of this tiny fungi here. It's at my fingertips. If I bring my face down there, the active track on the vlogging camera may pick it up. I'm not sure whether you can see that. I just put my finger in front of it. Now, the first challenge I had was I couldn't get a tripod at, chest height here. The mushroom's on a log. So I used a little mini tripod again. I'll bring my face down here so you can see. And I've literally just placed it and jammed in the legs against the branch. And it's held pretty solidly. Now, I spent 15 minutes, and that's the time invested in making sure I was happy with the composition. And the initial composition, I was happy with. Until I took it. And then I realised it was lacking something. And when I pulled the camera away, making the mushroom much smaller in the frame, I realised I had it down. So another 15 minutes passed by. So the composition that I'm happiest with is the mushroom is very, very small in the frame. And I've used a little LED light to accentuate it, just to give it prominence within the frame. And then the background is the sky and the trees in front of the sky, so a lovely light area. And there's a lovely out of focus green area, the moss here on the branch. But tip number 2 isn't so much about the composition, because composition, there are rules, but it's subjective, and it's finding what you think is beautiful within the frame and what makes sense within the frame to yourself. But the most important thing about composition, I think, is time. So time and composition are linked. Spend the time, devote the time to the subject, and the composition will come. So we're back on the ground for tip number 3. And tip number 3 is aperture, open it up. So why do we need to open up the aperture? And it is related to the chaotic environment of a woodland itself. The background is often branches, leaves, light. And we want to remove the detail associated with that chaos. And we do that by opening the aperture up. So instead of shooting at f8 or f9, and there's a good reason to do that, to shoot at a closed aperture of f8, f9, f10, and that's with regards to getting our subject in focus, or a good deal of our subject in focus. But by doing that, we gradually introduce more detail in the background, and that detracts from our subject. Ideally, if you do have a camera that focus stacks, we can open up the aperture to as open as it will go, and we can shoot a number of stacks to ensure that our subject is fully in focus and the background has a beautiful bokeh. So I found a little subject here, quite beautiful, and we'll try to bring the first 3 tips together. So we're going to bring tip number 1, number 2, and number 3 together in this image. We're low down, but I'm not low enough. I need to get on the ground because I want to look up at these mushrooms. I want to get the gills, and they're up on a little branch here, which is fantastic. So I need to be careful with these 3 mushrooms that they're harmonious in the frame. The 3 of them have a position, and that the 3 of them are considered with regards to the image we're taking. So we'll get lower down with the mini tripod, number 1. Number 2, we're going to consider the composition. And number 3, we're going to focus stack and open it up to create a beautiful bokeh in the background. Because what I'm seeing over here are fallen branches, we've the froggens, the bilberries. It's beautiful, but it won't look beautiful at f9, f10. And that's not to say that an aperture of f7 or f8 won't look beautiful as bokeh. It can do. I've often found that opening up the aperture to f2.8 or f3 creates too much of a blur. There's not enough detail in the background. And I'll put an image up there now which kind of illustrates that, where there is 0 detail, particularly when there's moss and nothing else but moss. And it's very subjective whether you like this type of image or not. Well, tip number 4 centres around the management of light, but particularly the darks. And with fungi, we're in a dark environment. We're close to the woodland floor. Light from above is largely blocked from reaching the woodland floor. And the fungi love that environment. Now, with the grouping of mushrooms we have on this log, we've 2 challenges. The first challenge is there's a large dark piece of log beneath the moss. And the decision I made is to exclude that altogether, bringing the camera even lower yet again. So that's one challenge removed. The second challenge is this grouping have particularly large caps. There is a group of them, and there's a lot of shade underneath there. So there are 2 ways that we can manage this challenge. The first is by increasing the exposure, therefore brightening the underside of the mushroom. But by doing that, we risk overexposing parts of the image, possibly the background, possibly the tops of the mushrooms, which can be quite reflective. The second way, and the way that I've used here, is to use a small LED light. It's not at its brightest, it's actually at its dimmest. It mightn't appear that way in the video. And it has illuminated the bottom of the mushroom. So I've combined all 4 tips today. The first, perspective. I'm very low down. I'm looking just slightly up at this grouping of beautiful mushrooms. The second, composition. Time. I'm 15 minutes here. I've worked this scene just a little bit, though it's quite simple. Number 3, aperture. So I have a beautiful bokeh in the background here of beech leaves and oak trees, etc. And number 4, I've managed the darks beneath the mushrooms using an artificial light.